Africa as a whole is about 8.5% by the end of 2025, increasing from 2024. But more noticeably, the shorter term, the 5-year growth rate is 10%. Now, we're not talking about growth in a period of high prices, because as we know, cashews take 3 to 7 years to mature. So we're talking about growth in a period of relatively lower prices. It's only in 2024, the first half of 2024, that we saw some of the lowest prices for 15 years. And between 2018 and mid-2024, we had a declining or a low price market. So it looks as if West African farmers want to grow more cashew nuts, whether or not the price is high. If we look at where they're grown, well, it's Cote d'Ivoire. Ivory Coast is the dominant force, 53%. My latest estimate of the crop is about 1.55 million tons. That's based on trade figures mainly. But it's growing everywhere. And if it continues to grow at the present rate, the crop would look like something around 5.6 million tons by 2030 if it grew at the present rate. That's an additional, about 1.9 million tons additional. That is the current equivalent of the total imports of Europe and the US for 2024. And there's big questions arising around this. Can we process it? Can we sell it? If we do sell it, can we ship it? Can the infrastructure, can the logistics system manage this kind of additional volume? So in a good year, I mean, good weather-wise, we could be looking at over 5 million tons in West Africa alone. And that's going to change the entire dynamic of this industry. A big trend in recent years, really underlined in 2025 with that record crop in West Africa. What about Cambodia? Cambodia was leading production over the last 5 or 6 years. It took over from West Africa around about 2020. And we saw growth in Cambodia between 2020 and 25 that has never been seen anywhere before, and indeed may never be seen again. We're probably around about 1 million tons of production this year. I'm working off 980,000 tons here. 90% of that is sold in shell as raw cashew nuts to Vietnam for processing there. If we look at the crop being a little bit later in 2025, we just look at the imports into Vietnam during the early part of the year. So Jan-Feb imports were down by almost 50%. It got into January, March, and that was down by 36%. But by the end of October, and most of this catching up was done in April and May, but by the end of October, imports to Vietnam from Cambodia were actually up by 18%. Growth has slowed in Cambodia, but of course it has. It couldn't possibly have been maintained at the rates we saw between 2019 and 2023. So we're looking at about 3%, but 3% growth, if that were to continue, is 3% of 1 million tons. That is significant. What's really been frustrating Cambodian cashew farmers in recent years, and it hasn't been right across the whole sector, is the impact of climate change, where we get some extreme weather, we can get extreme rains, we can get extreme periods of heat without rain and high temperatures. If that comes at the wrong time, it can damage the crop. But this year, so far, despite the floods that we've seen in southern Thailand, in parts of Vietnam, Cambodia seems to be okay, no more than okay. It is cooler. There are some showers. It was wetter between September and November than it would normally be. I'm not sure that that actually damages the crop. I suspect it might even help the crop. So I think we're looking at another good crop in Cambodia, but it is now in the flowering season. Anything can happen. We need to keep a close eye on the weather. Let's switch to demand, and let's switch to our third trend, which is the strong demand from Europe, and from India. So starting with Europe, here's the monthly imports into the 27 countries of the European Union plus the UK to make 28. And you can see the blue bars, that's the monthly imports in 2025, January all the way through to September, which is the latest official figures available. And what we see is in almost every month, with the exception of June, that exports were well ahead. So we're looking at a year where imports are 6.7% up to the end of September on 2024. We're looking at a growth rate of just under 5% over the last 10 years. And that's a strong growth rate for what is a relatively mature market. So trends in snacking, natural foods, trends in conscience-driven consumption are driving the consumption in Europe. All of that is underlined by consumers' concern for their health and well-being. Africa's share grew quickly. This year so far, we're looking at about 22%. That's up from 20% last year. That's up by 2%. That's 10% growth. That's significant. And now I think will continue. Positive outlook for Western Europe imports. If we look at the biggest market in the world, India, which of course doesn't import kernels, not very many of them, India imports raw cashew nuts. In fact, India is about 60% dependent on the imports of raw cashew nuts for its consumption. And India is the largest consuming market in the world. If we look at the chart, the green bars are month by month cumulative for 2025. So it's 1.26 million tons by the end of October. That now is over 1.3 million tons. That puts us close to the record year of 2022. So with imports up 23%, with about 1.3 million tons imported by the end of November, that gives us a growth rate of about 7%. India's market's growing. India's consumer group that can afford cashews and the deep cultural and gastronomic aspect of cashew in India means that India is very likely to continue to grow. But for the past 20 years, and on what we know now for the next 20 years, India's growth of consumption will be met by imports. There's very little evidence that Indian cashew production is growing at anything more than about 2%. That may increase. The government would like it to increase. I think most Indian stakeholders would like it to increase. But in the meantime, India protects its market. We'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about tariffs. But very positive year in India. Question would be whether or not the imports are a little bit excessive. There were some re-exports to Vietnam in the course of the year, somewhere between 70 and 100,000 tons. But out of 1.3 million tons, it still looks to me as if India may well finish with quite a high inventory, something like the beginning of 2023, which might mean a relatively slower start to the import season for raw cashew nuts from West Africa in the early part of next year. I don't think there's any negatives to the Indian side of it because I think Indian consumption is growing and I think that those cashew nuts will be consumed. If we look at the US and we look at tariffs, so the whole saga of tariffs being on, tariffs being off in 2025, and they're now off, as we know, this has had a huge impact on the imports to the United States. So as we stand at the end of August, these are the US ITC figures. The total imports are down by about 19% versus 2024. Now, 2024 was a very good year for imports. If we look at 2024 here, it's not at all surprising that imports would be down. But if we compare January to August 2024 to January to August 2025, there is a big drop. And it's lower than 23, 22, 21, So it's not just a rebalancing on the basis of high imports and stockpiling in 2024. It is a genuine decline based on the import tariffs, I think. So if we look at this, we also should note that processed imports have increased and that the import of processed goods, and that's about 45,000 tons a year. It's not a huge number, but it's an increasing number and it's an important number. 45,000 tons out of about 200,000 is significant. 91% supplied from Vietnam. That's actually more for processed. And Africa supplies about 8%, which has risen in the last year or so, but is still a pretty poor figure compared to the European figure of 22% this year. So what we've seen in 2024 a certain amount of stockpiling caused by the expectation of import tariffs, and that's been reflected in lower imports in 2025, which of course is also affected by the potential for lower consumption. And we don't know exactly how consumption has behaved, but we haven't seen any pickup in import activity. Now, it would be not a very good idea for importers to start bringing in lower cost cashews into the United States immediately after the removal of the tariffs. They would be actually undermining the value of their existing inventories. So I don't think that we're going to see an immediate spike. It will take some time for this message to get through, and it will take some time for the sentiment in the market to change. But you would expect that US buyers would return to the market, perhaps showing similar growth rates to Europe next year. But long term, I wouldn't expect that. Long term, the US growth in consumption is about 1.5%. So just let me remind you, we're looking at Europe just under 5% growth. We're looking at India import growth around about 7%. We're looking at the United States long-term growth at 1.5%, 2025 down 19%. Let's think about what that means compared to the type of production growth that we've been talking about in West Africa and in Cambodia. Continuing on the demand trends, and here's China, and this is remarkable. Vietnam's shipments to China, and we use Vietnam's shipments because we don't have full Chinese import figures just yet, and we won't have them till next year. But if we look at Vietnam's shipments up 39%, that's incredible. And if we look at the growth, 2022, 23, 24, 2025 to November, 165,000 tons. So far, in 2025, Vietnam has shipped more kernels to China than to the United States. That's a remarkable turnaround. Shipments to China are around about the same level as to Europe. So it's likely in 2025, almost certain now, that China will be the largest single importer as a country. The European Union will be larger, but as single countries, China will be the largest importer. And we're looking at 2021, we had a dip in 2022, but we had a dip in 2022 almost everywhere. We're looking at long-term growth. You can see that on the chart right back to 2013 and before that too. But there are certain erratic patterns in there. We've seen a drop back 2019 into 2020. Well, that's easily explained. That's COVID. We saw a drop back in 2015 into 2016. It wasn't a big drop, but it was a drop. 2021 into 2022 is the economy. So there is long-term growth, but it is somewhat erratic. And I just think about what 2025 might have looked like in the markets without this remarkable growth of Vietnam's shipments to China. It would have looked very different here. So what's happening is we're getting a growing dependence on China, which has come in as a new market in certainly the last 10 years, but really in the last 5 years. And we have to start to understand Chinese consumption of cashew nuts a little bit better. For example, there is a big market for US tree nuts in China. There has been in the past. We have seen back in 2015-16 demand drop away when prices rose. So what will happen in the Chinese market if prices rise? What will happen if the tariffs on US tree nuts were reduced? How volatile is demand likely to be? How segmented is it likely to be? We see a spike at the moment in the demand for the large nuts. That's mainly coming from Chinese demand. How is that likely to work in the coming years? And to what extent are we dependent on China as a new market? New markets are always likely to be volatile. Less optimistic is the trend that we've seen this year in informal trade across African borders. Now, we use informal, meaning it's not registered, it's not properly recorded, and we get to the numbers by working out what's left. You take out the exports, you take out the processing, you look at the crop, and you see what are the patterns of trade. And in the map on the left-hand side, the red lines, this is what's known as informal trade, but we could also call it illegal trade. It may be illegal to export cross-border from Cote d'Ivoire to Ghana, but it's not illegal in Ghana to import, and likewise for Togo and Nigeria from Benin. And that's why we call it informal as opposed to illegal. But it is largely illegal in the countries of origin. And there's three real centers for this: Guinea-Bissau, Cote d'Ivoire, and Benin. Benin with its ban on RCN exports, Cote d'Ivoire with its management of RCN exports and the ban on land-based export, and Guinea-Bissau with its ban on exports, or its, well, largely ineffective ban, but there is a ban there on exports cross-border, which mostly go into Senegal. This happens for several reasons. We have the certain fact that there are differences in policy and a lack of harmonization on export tax policy between countries. We have outright bans which cannot be enforced. That's a second reason. And the third reason is often more market-based. I mean, there are often good reasons why product would travel to one port as opposed to another. So if you look at certain parts of eastern Cote d'Ivoire, it makes sense. In a free market, it would make sense to ship from areas which are on the border through Ghanaian ports. It would make cost sense, it would make logistical sense, but the law doesn't allow it. Now, this trade is growing. It's growing in West Africa. It's grown again this year, having dropped back in 2024. And it is also a fact in East Africa. So there are reports of trade between Mozambique and Tanzania, cross-border trade, particularly this year when the Tanzanian crop was a little bit late. I saw a newspaper report from Mozambique mentioning 6,000 tons crossing the border. That would be no surprise. And there is probably trade between Tanzania and Kenya too. There is no Tanzanian ban on this trade. And in any case, it would be very difficult. So work, for example, in East Africa between IAM from Mozambique and the Cashew Board of Tanzania to work together and perhaps someday to harmonize policy would end this trade. One of the most amazing things about this trade is that some of the biggest players in our industry, particularly the big RCN traders, they completely turn a blind eye to this. It is bad news for farmers. This does not help the farmers in any way. The short-term benefit of being able to sell your product to a smuggler and move it away is outweighed by the longer-term disadvantages. And if we look at it, it causes a loss of revenue for governments, which means there is, in theory at least, less to spend on the development of the sector. It distorts prices. So there are often two prices: the conventional legitimate market route and the informal smuggled market route. It therefore creates market price volatility. And market price volatility is probably the biggest problem for farmers because whereas those of us who are in the trading business or are in the trading business, we live with volatility, we learn to manage it. If I'm relying on cashews to pay for my food, my education, my inputs for next year, then price volatility, that lack of predictability, that lack of reliability is very bad news and could put my living in jeopardy. Add to that the threats of climate change, and you can see a spiral happening. So the loss of transparency, the loss of traceability means that through this informal trade, through this smuggling, our industry is actually moving away from the very things that it is marketing itself on. So in West Africa, cashews are being presented as natural, sustainable, traceable. The sector is presenting itself as transparent, but this trade is distorting that. And what that does effectively is it leads to a criminalization of certain elements of the industry. And that creates a kind of I won't say, well, I will say almost anarchy at certain times of the year. If we look at the way trade operates in Ghana early in the season, it's partially due to this movement of product across the border, where we get these wild swings in price. We get too much money chasing too little product. We get opportunism and we get speculation. Similarly, in Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, later in the year, similar pattern of trade. This is destructive trade, and it primarily exists because of differences in regulation and policy between countries. Moving on, this year we saw a lot of foreign exchange volatility, and this is a difficult one to manage. We saw the US dollar lose big time, almost 10% against the euro. We saw the Indian rupee so far this year losing about 6% against the US dollar. That makes imports more expensive. We saw the Tanzanian shilling gain against the US dollar, which means that prices are going to be lower because Tanzania doesn't, unfortunately, set the prices the world market does. And we saw the CFA in West Africa. We saw, because of its link to the euro, partially, we saw it gain almost 11% against the US dollar. This changed a lot of things in terms of pricing. It means greater risk for everyone, for exporters, for suppliers, and ultimately for farmers. It means lower cost kernels and destinations. So in Europe, if we're buying in dollars and selling in euros, it means lower cost kernels. Similarly for China. But in the US, of course, it doesn't because the US will buy and sell in US dollars. The weaker Indian rupee, and we've seen some volatility on that in the past week, means that raw cashew nuts are going to be a higher cost. So either raw cashew nut prices at origin need to be lower to compensate that, or consumer prices in India need to be higher. And that will depend on what is going on at a particular time of year. It'll depend on the supply and demand situation, but it creates volatility. Generally speaking, if you read the analysts and economists, they'll tell you that exchange rate volatility impacts commodities like raw cashew nuts more than it does finished products like cashew kernels. So in essence, it's easier for buyers or exporters to pass their price disadvantage created through currency volatility onto farmers who are effectively price takers in our business. So the foreign exchange disadvantages are passed on to farmers, but rarely, because of the structure of our industry, because we have an RCN market and we have a cashew kernels market, particularly in West Africa, where the RCN market is so much bigger than the cashew kernels market so far, it's more likely that the disadvantage will be passed on to farmers than the advantage will be passed on. So what we're looking at is we're looking at factors of volatility in price, factors of volatility in supply and demand, and trends which appear to be gathering strength that will encourage prices probably to come under pressure in the coming years. And this, of course, is a concern for particularly for growers, but it's also a concern for the future of the industry. Now, if we add into that another factor, another trend of volatility, which is the development of policy, and I'm going to focus on West Africa, but this might apply in other countries too. If we look on the policy uncertainty and the lack of clarity in the long-term development policy, I think we're looking at another factor which could cause volatility on prices in the future. So we've seen a lot of headlines this year. We've seen headlines in Nigeria, a lot of discussion about export bans on raw cashew nuts. You know my view on that if you were with us in any of the recent webinars. We've seen discussion about Burma kernels, some ideas that India should allow them to be imported. Some countries are beginning to tax them. Mozambique is taxing Burma kernels now. And we've seen discussions in Ghana about supply chain. And what we're seeing a lot is we're seeing vested interests in countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and elsewhere much more openly try to influence government policy than in the past. And that's probably because there is more government policy now than there was in the past. There is growing intervention by governments in African countries in the cashew sector and also in other sectors. And governments are faced with big questions. We're looking at increasing production. How to manage that? Is processing locally the answer to that? We're looking at, over the last 10 years, a massive increase in the raw cashew nut trade. Trade to Vietnam and India, the processing centers of the world, has just exploded in the last decade. And when we look at policy and we look at different interventions from different governments, which are often made with the best intentions, but which often completely confound logic in terms of what the neighboring countries might be doing, we're going to see more informal trade. We're going to see more market volatility. We're going to see more vested interests trying to influence policy. And it leads me to a question in terms of what kind of investors do we need in this sector? What kind of investors would be in a position to manage this volatility? Because increasing production, we might regard it as a problem, but it's also an opportunity. Developing policy, incentives for processing, these are also opportunities, and there are enormous opportunities in the African cashew sector. Some of these trends are just making it a little bit more difficult to build investor confidence. So the more interventions by governments means the more responsibility to manage them. And this is where we're seeing some conflict in the last 12 months. So let's move on to our ninth trend. And our ninth trend is the development of the Tanzanian auction this year. And that's very topical at the moment. So right now we can look at what's been sold up to the end of week 5. I go Saturday to Saturday on this. About 375,000 tons sold up to week 5. That was, I think it's Tuesday's figure, compared to week 5, same period last year, about 248,000 tons sold. So it's way ahead. There's about 400,000 tons intaken up to Tuesday, according to the Cashew Board. 94% of that, they say, is sold. The sales are up 61% in the first 4 weeks, but we're seeing now, as you would expect, and the orange bars are the weekly sales, naturally sales are going to decline a little bit. Week 5 is, by the way, not the full week in 2025. Week 5 is just up to Tuesday. So what we are seeing after the first initial excitement, the volume has dropped back, but it's been relatively consistent. About 30,000 tons has been shipped so far, so that's going to arrive at the end of December. I think most of that is going to India And we're looking at our crop estimate now around about 550,000 tons. Just to put some dates on this, if we look at week four, so week four in 2024 was the 1st of November. Week four in 2025 is the 5th of December, ending the 5th of December. So essentially, we're looking at much higher volume, but about a month later. So this brings the question, will buyers continue to support the market? So material they've bought now is going to arrive end of December. The next lot, January. So when we get towards arrivals at the end of January, is there going to be the same level of interest? And I'm not sure, so therefore I would expect it to slip away. But with 400,000 tons intaken, that would mean that there is something like 125,000 tons left to sell, assuming that processing is around about 10% up on what it was last year. It will be interesting to see. Prices are pretty steady. I mean, there is a slight downward trend on prices, as you might expect from the beginning. It's not as significant as I thought it might be. There is a bit of volatility in the calculation, but of course, don't forget different lots come up every week, slightly different qualities and locations, and that's impacting the price calculation. So therefore we get this zigzag pattern. But if we look at the trend, the dotted line, it's relatively steady over the period. Much more steady than one might have expected. And that's, I think, probably due to the fact that this year we started at much more realistic levels than last year. If you remember last year, there was a period of real speculation early in the season, and that proved to be quite costly. So it looks to me as if we get a crop of about 550,000 tons, there may be some small volumes left. But if we get beyond that, if it goes 550 up to 600,000 tons, then I think, as I was saying 2 weeks ago, we may end up with some volumes unsold. If that happens, the authorities in Tanzania need to support their processors to get that product shifted. And perhaps there's an opportunity in that too. Other Southern Hemisphere crops, well, we look at Mozambique. Crop in the north is ongoing. It's been ongoing for some time. The crop in the central area, I'm informed by IAM, which is doing a good job in giving us information, giving the market information generally this year, started a little bit earlier, and the crop in the southern areas should be starting around about now. But obviously, most of the production in Mozambique is in the northern part of the country. Cabo Delgado and Nampula will be the two major producing areas. So if we look at that, exports, IAM told me this morning, and thank you for that, Lucia, the exports will start on the 19th of December. The reference price for 46 pounds is £12.50. This is the reference price FOB. And for £53, £14.40. Most product is of the lower quality in Mozambique. Farmgate prices had spiked up. We talked about this 2 weeks ago. Farmgate prices spiked early in the season, and then they eased back a little bit. It looks like the mechanism, its job this year. Prices seem reasonable given the quality. Early on, there was quite a lot of competition. So I think that this spike in prices was due to the late crop in Tanzania and some of the spike chasing after product, which can now be exported from the 19th. But that factor is probably gone at this stage. There have been rains, and this may reduce the estimate. So the official estimate was 200,000 tons. That would be a super crop. Probably it's a little bit lower than that now. I think that certainly the optimistic end of the crop estimates were reduced. So we had the official estimate around 200,000 tons, and we had trade estimates anywhere from 120,000 tons to 140,000 tons. Both are probably a little bit lower now. There might be some concern on quality. We're not sure of that, of course, but time will tell. We'll know in the next week or so. The market, 1450 to 1550 are the cost and freight offers that I've seen. That Yeah, pretty much reflects the farm gate price, at least the higher end of it. There might maybe a little bit of negotiation in that, but the product should move. They think about 60,000 tons will be available for export this year. That's a pretty decent figure, and it will be needed, and it will move probably to Vietnam. There has been some smuggling reported, as I mentioned earlier, and that's this red line. That's also informal trade. So some of the higher quality raw materials slipping off into Tanzania because of the lateness of the Tanzanian crop. There's also one or two reports, more worrying really, of smuggling through the ports, which is certainly an illegal activity, and that is to avoid two things: export tax at 18%, but also to export earlier. And that's worrying, and that has happened in the past in Mozambique too. So it still looks good. Looks like market mechanisms working. Looks like the prices make sense. Looks like the 60,000 tons available for export, if that's the right figure, will go. If we look at overall then the situation in the Southern Hemisphere, we see strong growth. So this is based on our most recent calculations. So this is the revised estimate for Tanzania and for Mozambique. Looking at this, I think again, we're looking at strong growth in East Africa. We're looking at now probably steady crops in Brazil with a little bit of volatility, but Brazil is no longer a significant factor in production. And we're looking at steady crops in Indonesia. Very difficult to estimate accurately for Indonesia. But overall, driven by East Africa, fast growth. We're looking at 5-year CAGR 8.2%. That's strong growth. That's even stronger than parts of West Africa. The 10-year growth rate, well, you can see it from the chart, it's 5.1%. And you can see that the acceleration. So we had very strong growth up to 2018, a little bit of a dip. Tanzania now has come back into the frame with strong growth, and we're seeing this continue to grow. If the Cashew Board of Tanzania is right, this will continue. And we also know that in Mozambique, the government has launched or is proposing to launch a program to support the industry, which would mean that production there will also grow. So we've 10 trends, positive in terms of production, positive in terms of demand, but a little bit out of sync with each other. And we have certain factors this year that added volatility: informal trade, foreign exchange volatility, policy volatility. And of course, it's a volatile sector anyway. The nature of the trade, the type of supply chain that we work in, the impact of the weather, but also the impact in the longer term of climate change is making this sector more volatile. And there are some things that we're not talking about, and these are what I'm calling the elephants in the room. And these are really important trends which I think need more attention. Firstly, production is growing faster than consumption. And it's not just about price. So farmers are not only increasing production when prices are high, they're increasing production every year. Climate change, yeah, for sure, it can disrupt production. We've seen indications of that in Cambodia. We've seen that in the past in Vietnam. But it can also increase production. So how can climate change increase production? Well, simply by making more areas suitable for growing cashews and less suitable for growing other crops. So there is research, it's done some years ago, but it indicates that the areas in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and West Africa generally that will become suitable for growing of cashew nuts and therefore less suitable for growing of crops like cocoa will increase, and that could increase production. The third factor is really, have farmers benefited from processing in African countries? I think this is a really big question. The theory, going back many years, has always been, I was a proponent of this theory, that processors would treat farmers better than the raw cashew nut trade does. And it's clearly not the case. Processing has not delivered in Africa. And it would be interesting to know, why is that? Is it the culture? Is it the type of investor? Is it the trading business? Is it the lack of actual cashew kernels buyers being involved in processing? And we really need to ask this question. How have farmers benefited? Have they benefited? Could they benefit more? Or are we really working here on a theory that's in some way flawed? And that's a big trend that we're not talking about and we need to talk about. The fourth one is India. So India is the largest consumer of cashew kernels in the world by far, but it also has the highest import tariffs in the world. So what seems to be happening in India is that we have a growing industry, growing consumption. That growing consumption is fed by imports of raw cashew nuts. Those raw cashew nuts come from African countries. That trade is largely unsustainable in environmental terms, although in financial terms and economic terms, it is sustainable. These high import tariffs are protecting an industry, that is the Indian processing industry, that really seems to be in need of an upgrade. So India's got this question now, well, what to do? Certainly, Indian consumers have a taste for cashew nuts. That's not going to change. Certainly, snack foods, possibly conscience-driven consumption, where people are looking at all the aspects of their foods, is going to be an increasing trend in India. That would not be surprising, but it's being supplied by imports. So, does India increase its production? Does India upgrade its processing? Or does India open its market? The last one is highly unlikely. The other two is the choice that's faced. But it seems clear to me that at the moment, the import tariffs on kernels, which I think are sensible, I would have to admit, though I don't often say that about import tariffs, it's protecting an industry that really is in need of an upgrade. When's that going to happen? The final trend, the final elephant, is that cashews around the world, from China through Europe, Middle East, and in North America, are generally sold as a natural food, a sustainable food, but it's actually not a sustainable product as it stands. The supply chain, with the movement of 4 million tons of raw cashew nuts around the world every year, is actually a high emissions chain. It's high emissions and low transparency. So the marketing approach that's been adopted and the assumption that cashew nuts are natural, which they are, but the assumption that because they're natural, they're sustainable, is very difficult to argue. When you look at the raw cashew nut trade, when you look at some of the processing industries around the world, we have to ask ourselves, what would the consumers around the world who are buying this product, what would they think if they actually knew how this industry works? And that is probably the biggest elephant in the room. So let's have a look at some of the early factors that will influence 2026. So this is a little bit of crystal ball gazing, if you like. Possibly we're going to see a higher carry out of raw cashew nuts in India than ideal, than may have been seen in earlier years. And that will influence buying early in the season. That will influence the volumes and that will influence the starting point for Indian cashew buying in West Africa. If we look at the calendar, and we've got a later Lunar New Year, so Chinese New Year is a little bit later. Ramadan is earlier this year than in previous years, so we're beginning to see buying for Ramadan now. We've seen it already, and the buying season for New Year in China will go on a little bit longer or a little bit later than we might normally see. So this is a positive demand factor in this period, December, January, early part of February, then also for Ramadan. Third factor, we're going to see these large East African crops shipped a little bit later than previously. This particularly applies to Tanzania. So I mentioned the first arrivals from Tanzania in India will be the end of December. That's later than you would normally expect. That could be up to a month later than you'd normally expect. And that's going to have an impact. So we have a higher carryout in India. We have later arrivals, but we have stronger demand for kernels in mainly from Vietnam in the case of the Lunar New Year, because that's mainly China, and a mix between India and Vietnam, and increasingly East Africa for demand for the Ramadan period. This means we've a certain amount of conflicting signals here. Chinese demand is, of course, the question. Can we or will we see Chinese demand continue at this level of growth? And I think my guess is next year we will. It will be another good year for imports into China, and that will support demand. And if the United States were to return to the market, that would also be a factor. Now, what I haven't mentioned here, of course, is the timing of the crop. So at the moment, there are some indications that crops in West Africa will be early. That would feed into this system. But if India has a high carry out, then India may not be in the market. If the East African crops are shipped a little bit later, that might also give Vietnam some breathing space. But also bear in mind that in recent years, the availability of huge volumes from Cambodia means that the necessity for Vietnamese buyers to come to West Africa earlier has gone. They've got the guts of 1 million tons coming through from Cambodia. Now, granted, that's 80% larger cashew nuts with very specific market destinations, but it is cashew nuts and it is a lot of volume. So last year it was quite late, as I mentioned. This year, we don't know yet, but it looks on time. And so that may well ease the early season. So if I add up these things, I've got, on the one hand, a longer seasonal demand in China and for Ramadan. That means that kernels inventories will be depleted, but RCN inventories are likely to be higher as we enter the Northern Hemisphere season because higher imports into India, higher imports into Vietnam too, of course, but those are largely used up by the huge export numbers. And then the late shipment of crops from East Africa. So it does look to me on this basis that we might see quite a reasonably good December, January, and then a very quiet period to follow. During that period, February is often a time when buyers in Western countries, in Europe, and in North America start to have a look for their next tranche of cover. They would already be covered for the first half of next year. You're not going to see frantic buying from either Europe or the United States for the first half of next year. But by the time February comes around, they might be back in the market again, and you can see some buying. There is another factor I'd mention, and that is import tariffs. So the use of import tariffs as a negotiating tool, or as one journalist put it recently, the weaponization of import tariffs. And it's not only the US that does that, but the weaponization of import tariffs has an impact. This one's not gone away. I do not believe that we've seen the end of the discussion on tariffs. It's been effective as a negotiating tool, so it will be used again. I don't think we'll see them directly for cashew nuts. I think, and I hope that one is done. But we may well see the economic impact of import tariffs again in 2026. So several factors that will influence the early weeks of next year. I think we need to keep an eye on the final total of Indian imports, an eye on Chinese demand from Vietnam, and of course, how the remaining part of the Tanzanian auction pans out.